Yeah, hi. Dave, thank you for doing this. Chloe, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Wolf Institute and ISGAP's seminar series in contemporary anti-Semitism studies, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Dave Rich to be speaking with us today. Dave is the head of policy at the Community Security Trust, the CST, and is a leading expert on left-wing anti-Semitism, according to the Jewish Chronicle. He is an associate research fellow at the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, where he completed his PhD. And in 2016, he published a book entitled The Left's Jewish Problem, Jeremy Corbyn, Israel and Anti-Semitism, which began as his doctoral dissertation. The title of his talk today is Anti-Semitism and the Gaza Conflict in May 2021, What Was New and What Was Old. So I shall now hand over to Dave, and please join me in welcoming him to speak with us today.
Thanks, Chloe, and thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks to everyone for joining us. You may well have seen a couple of weeks ago, CST, my organisation, released our anti-Semitic incidents report for 2021, which showed that last year was the worst year in CST's records for anti-Semitic hate incidents and hate crimes in the UK. We recorded more anti-Semitic incidents than in any previous year, and we've been counting them since 1984. And the main reason why last year was the worst year on record is because during and after the conflict in Israel and Gaza in May last year, we saw a massive spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. And this is not a new phenomenon. We've seen it in previous years where Israel has been at war, particularly in Gaza in 2014 and 2009, and Lebanon in 2006. And each time we get these massive spikes in attacks, abuse and threats directed at Jewish people, organisations and institutions in the UK during that conflict. And each time it reflects the contours of how people are relating to that conflict and anti-Semitic reactions to it. Now, this isn't the full story about anti-Semitism in the UK last year, because last year was the fifth year out of the last six where we've seen a record number of incidents. So there's a longer term problem. But in terms of what happened last year, I think it's worth really going in a bit of depth in terms of what happened in the month of May. What happened during that conflict in Israel and Gaza, and what was it that stood out that was different in terms of the anti-Semitism during that period in particular compared to what we normally see in the UK? And also, what do we think created the environment? What is the broader context in which that took place? So that's what I'm going to be covering today. And I am just going to share my screen. And there's a few things I'm going to pick out, right? First thing, as I said, look, on the left is a briefing that a lot of this is taken from, which is on the CST website, which you can read and download. The graph on the right is a graph of 2 months worth of anti-Semitic incidents reported to CST from early April to early June last year. Now, looking at that graph, I'm sure I don't need to tell you when the conflict in Israel and Gaza really escalated, when it was that people started to die, when TV screens, newspapers, social media started filling up with images of open warfare and armed conflict, particularly in and around Gaza, and it was mapped in almost directly correlates to the number of anti-Semitic incidents seen in this country and the way that they increased in that kind of period in early May. And just to be clear, at CST, we differentiate between incidents that use anti-Jewish language, such as conspiracy theories or anti-Jewish insults, where Jewish people and property are targeted because they're Jewish, or where there's other evidence of anti-Semitic motivation, which is what we count as incidents, we differentiate that from what you might consider ordinary or legitimate political campaigning opposition to Israel or criticism of Israel, even if that criticism of Israel is harsh and is expressed in angry terms. So what kind of incidents are we talking about? This is the bit where I have to apologize for the offensive language and imagery, which I'm about to show. There's nothing graphic, but there is some offensive language. Unfortunately, that's the nature of dealing with anti-Semitism. But here are 3 examples of the types of incidents we saw. You have physical assaults, Jewish people being physically attacked because they're Jewish, in the atmosphere, in the context of increased anti-Semitism. Thankfully, this is only a minority of incidents. So in 2021 as a whole, only about 8% of anti-Semitic incidents reported CST were violent, but some of them, we do get a handful that are extremely dangerous and disturbing. And this was one in particular. The 2 people are now awaiting trial after quite serious assault on a rabbi in Essex. The one at the bottom left is social media, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that social media is a place where all forms of hate spread very easily. And this one I think is interesting because you can see the date, 20th of May, it's right in the heart of when the conflict was happening in Israel and in Gaza. And here you can see very clearly the use of the word Zionist as a direct euphemism for Jew, talking about Zionists, in their word, in Manchester, which is where the 2nd largest Jewish community lives in the UK, getting their curls cut off. Now, this is clearly a reference to the strictly Orthodox Haredi community that lives in North Manchester and is very visible in parts of North Manchester. And it's using the word Zionist as a direct euphemism for Haredi Jews, many of whom, of course, politically are not Zionist. And that's the kind of irony in this, but that's how anti-Semitism operates. And then on the right, you've got graffiti, and it's a piece of graffiti on the door of a synagogue in Norwich. And I think it's a piece of graffiti that is well worth a little bit of unpacking, because at the top you have a racist insult for Jews, which is very common on the far right, especially on the American far right. It's just a bog standard racist insult. And at the bottom, you have a swastika, again, a neo-Nazi symbol. In the middle, you have this slogan, Free Palestine, that in and of itself, Free Palestine is just an ordinary political slogan. It's not anti-Semitic, but it's being used here in an anti-Semitic way because it's daubed onto the door of a synagogue, clearly designed to offend, to upset, to make the people using the synagogue feel threatened. So the building's been targeted because it's Jewish. But also it's placed in a political context where it's surrounded by overtly anti-Semitic and extremist imagery, symbols, and language. And I think this is just a reminder that a lot of the anti-Semitism, the surge in anti-Semitism that we see when Israel is at war, is not really a direct response to what is actually happening in Israel or in Gaza. It's using that issue as an excuse, as a vehicle, as a platform to express a pre-existing hatred of Jews. And that's where you get this mixture of language. Whoever did this graffiti, they know that this is the kind of stuff you daub on the door of a synagogue to cause offense and harassment and fear to the people using the synagogue. And it's this mixture of language which I think is significant. But there were some things we saw that were very specific to what was going on in Israel and that really did appear to be driven by anti-Semitic reactions to it. And one of these was convoys. We saw an extraordinary number of convoys of cars with Palestinian flags, with people in shouting Free Palestine, driving into and through Jewish neighborhoods in towns and cities all over the UK. This is an image from probably the best known one, which was in London on Finchley Road where there was a whole massive convoy of cars that come down from various towns in the northwest and northeast of England. They'd come down to London for a big demonstration in central London. And as they drove through Jewish neighbourhoods in North London, people were shouting abuse at Jewish people on the streets. And in one case, someone was filmed on camera shouting through a megaphone really horrific, violent, anti-Semitic and misogynistic threats. 4 people are now awaiting trial for this particular incident. But in general, you know, most of these convoys were in Manchester and London because that's where most of the Jewish community lives. But we had them everywhere from Glasgow to Bournemouth. And this, again, was an example of the weaponization of pro-Palestinian language and symbols as a tool through which to harass Jewish people on the streets of this country. And it was a very particular type of anti-Semitic harassment that we hadn't really seen before. And again, you know, it's very important to stress, I think, that it's taking symbols and language that in and of themselves are not anti-Semitic, but using them in an anti-Semitic way, in an anti-Semitic context. And of course, when people got to those demonstrations, what they found is a minority of people using the demonstrations to display explicitly anti-Semitic images. There were huge demonstrations all over the country, as there always are when Israel has war. And Israel is the only foreign policy issue that generates this level of mobilization, of anger, of emotion from across, particularly the British left, but also from within Muslim communities in this country, which is something I'll come on to in more detail. It's the only issue that does it. You know, we're potentially on the verge of seeing a conflict in Ukraine. There's no demonstrations about that really at the moment. No one's really interested to that degree. But when Israel is at war, you get these huge demos. And what you get is some people who go to these demos and they take signs comparing Israel to Nazi Germany and even bearing swastikas. And I think this is something, again, really important to consider. It's not a new thing, comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, but it is very, very common, and it always comes out at times like this. And I just do question the motivation and the emotional drivers of people who go to a demonstration against the world's only Jewish state, taking a placard with a swastika on it. And this is the only type of political demonstration where it is almost legitimate and accepted to carry a swastika placard in this country. And we saw a lot of these. You know, there were quite a lot of examples of people who had sat at home on the morning of the demonstration with a blank piece of cardboard and a marker pen or a paintbrush, thinking to themselves, what's the most important message I can put on my placard to really drive home what this is all about? And then they ended up writing stuff about Hitler, about Nazism, portraying Netanyahu, who was prime minister at the time, as Adolf Hitler, talking about the Holocaust and so on. Now, this was only a minority of people. I have to stress that. Only a minority on these demos. But there were quite a few. It included young people as well, young people who have been through school where Holocaust education is compulsory part of the national curriculum. And what we didn't see is people around them telling them to take these placards down. We didn't see any kind of policing of this issue from within this movement. And I think that's a really important part of this picture. You know, there will always be a minority of people who turn up with anti-Semitic placards or racist placards to other kinds of demos. And I think it's incumbent on other people in the movement and the leaders and organisers of the movement to really police that and make it very clear that that is not welcome and not acceptable. We didn't see any of that on these demos. We just saw a minority of people bringing these placards and being allowed to carry them along without challenge. Now, of course, this comparison of Israel to Nazi Germany is all over social media as well. This is one of just loads of Instagram posts and posts on other platforms. This one had nearly 40,000 likes, making exactly this comparison, comparing an Israeli soldier to a Nazi soldier and a Palestinian to a Jewish victim. And the thing about it being on social media is that this is where it gets into teenage networks and secondary school networks. And we had one of the things that was new this time around that we haven't seen before was a very large number of complaints to us from secondary school Jewish children studying not at Jewish schools but at mainstream schools, who are suddenly seeing all their friends' social media pages filling up with images like this, and with really quite extreme anti-Israel content, and every other kid in the class is posting this and they're not because they're the one Jewish kid, and all of a sudden their friends don't want to talk to them anymore, or they're getting singled out and they're getting anti-Semitic abuse. And not only was this Jewish kids, but we were getting complaints from Jewish teachers who were getting anti-Semitic abuse because every single time they walked down the corridor, kids were shouting Free Palestine at them because they're the one Jewish teacher in the school. And this was a new thing this time compared to what we saw the last time Israel had a really large conflict in Gaza in 2014. We didn't see anything like that impacting schools. And I think that is largely down to the role played by social media in really driving the discourse, driving the narratives that were going on this time around. Now, on the demonstrations, it wasn't just comparisons with Israel to Nazi Germany. There were other types of anti-Semitic narratives as well. So this is one placard claiming, the entire British media is just Israeli propaganda. So that's, a classic old anti-Semitic stereotype. Some really older ideas. On the left, you've got Benjamin Netanyahu as a devil, not just Hitler, but a devil. On the right, you've got Netanyahu as a snake, alongside Boris Johnson as a snake. This is really old anti-Semitic iconography, really. Probably from people who have no idea that is what they are referring back to, that's how far back this goes. And if you want to know how far back it goes, here's one from a demonstration. This is in central London again. Someone with a placard with a picture of Jesus carrying his cross with Palestinians written alongside him. Do not let them do the same thing today again. And of course, in that slogan, them refers to Jews. It can only be Jews. It can't be Israel. And do the same thing today again. So it's the old anti-Semitic myth that Jews killed Jesus. Really the starting point, the origin point of Western European anti-Semitism being revived in a 21st century demonstration against Israel. So when we talk about what was old and what was new, we have the very new, but we have the extremely old as well when it comes to the way anti-Semitism repeats. Now, in terms of the sort of political slogans, the political bracketing of how this anti-Semitism happened, we saw something that I think is relatively new in terms of the British pro-Palestinian scene is, or if not new, then certainly a revival, certainly not something that in recent years we haven't seen so much of, is this revival of the kind of from the river to the sea chants. So talking about a single democratic state of Palestine, which is the placard on the left, and the placard on the right as well, is language that really derives from kind of Arab nationalism. In recent years, certainly in previous conflicts in 2014 and 2009, which are the two comparisons that I keep going back to, the language was much more kind of from Islamist extremism. And here, this time, we saw much more of this kind of secularized Arab nationalist language. And this chant from the river to the sea is now kind of the go-to chant on anti-Israel demonstrations in this country. And obviously, it's a chant in which the implication is, the chant goes from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The implication being there won't be an Israel in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea anymore. And it's quite interesting to see this mixture of different types of political discourses coming back into the kind of the anti-Israel discourse, the anti-Israel language that we see. And you have this mixture. This is an example of the kind of mixture I'm talking about. There's a There's a chant, an Arabic chant we hear on a lot of these demonstrations, which goes Khyber, Khyber, Ya Yahud, Jaish Muhammad, South Yahud. It's a referral to the Battle of Khyber, which is written about in the Quran when Muhammad's army defeated a Jewish tribe. So it's very much a kind of religious chant that harks back to the times of the Prophet Muhammad and so on. And yet the group we saw chanting this on one of the main demonstrations in London was led by two people on the left who you can see wearing T-shirts of Saddam Hussein, right, of a Ba'athist, kind of the apogee of secular Arab nationalism. So you have this real merging of kind of secular and religious discourses and icons and motivations and drivers coming from kind of a younger generation of activists, if you like. And this was reflected in the anti-Semitic incident statistics reported to us. And I'll explain what these circles and blobs and numbers you're looking at is. At CST, when people report anti-Semitic incidents to us, we always ask them, can you describe the person who shouted abuse at you or who attacked you? If it's online on social media, or we'll look at the profiles and so on, the social media profiles and so on. And we do this to get descriptions to help the police so that when they make their police report, there's as much evidence as possible. But it also gives us some analytical data that we can break down to look at the kind of appearance and the kind of demographics of who it is who's carrying out anti-Semitic hate crimes in this country. And we look for ethnic appearance. We also ask about age. We ask about gender and so on. Now, in a normal year, in a normal period, most anti-Semitic incident offenders for whom we get a description are described to us as being white. And yet during May, and these figures are just from the month of May, as you can see, that was not the case. And actually, you had this inverted kind of spectrum where there were many more anti-Semitic incident offenders described to us by the victims or witnesses as being of primarily Arab or North African appearance or South Asian appearance, and less so of white appearance. Now, people always try and extrapolate this to offenders who are Muslim, and that's always, you have to always be very careful about that, because these are physical appearances, not ideological or religious descriptions. But what it does show, I think, is that when the amount of anti-Semitism we're seeing is being driven by events in the Middle East, by conflicts involving Israel, we do tend to see a different type of perpetrator, as well as a different type of language, where the language is much more focused on Israel and Palestine rather than, say, neo-Nazi language and so on. So we get this kind of shift. Now, the other thing we saw, moving away from the kind of hate crimes and into kind of the broader extremist activity, we saw a definite pattern of extremist actors and organizations in this country trying to use the conflict that was going on in Israel and in Palestine to really stir things up to Muslim and Jewish communities. And I'll give you, this is an example. I'll explain what I mean. This is a van you can see with big screens on the side that turned up in Golders Green, which is probably the best known Jewish neighborhood in the country, one Saturday afternoon, so a Shabbat afternoon, during the conflict. And on the side of the van were kind of pictures revolving on a slideshow, some from Gaza, some from Israel, and some from the Holocaust. You can see the one on the right more clearly says, of Holocaust survivors saying, did we not learn from the Holocaust? Now, this van was brought there by 3 Islamist YouTubers who have a combined following online of around almost 1.5 million people. They brought this van to Golders Green. They parked it there, and they started stopping Jewish people walking down the street, filming them, shoving a microphone under their nose, and filming them and challenging them about what was happening in Israel and in Gaza, and filming their responses. Here you can see this image more closely. They actually took the van to the BBC the next day, which is where that is. And what they did was, so you can see they filmed their responses, they clipped it into a 15-minute edited package, which they put on YouTube. And if you can read the name of the video on YouTube, they called it "Muslims Confront Radical Israelis, Police Called." Now, all the people they stopped in the street were British. And none of them were Israeli. They were British Jews in Golders Green. But they called them radical Israelis, and they portrayed themselves as kind of brave Muslim warriors confronting the radical Israelis. The police were called, etc. It was incredibly inflammatory, and on the right-hand side are two of the comments posted under this video on YouTube, and you can see it was clearly inciting people looking at this video, firing them up to go to Jewish neighbourhoods in London and go and presumably confront Jewish people there. And if you can just see, those of you with good eyesight, the video, this point where they... At this point where we took this screenshot, it had almost 270,000 views on YouTube, and it had only been up for a few days. And this is just a classic example of a bunch of extremists really using the conflict to stir things up. Now, if you look at this fellow on the right here, the large guy on the right of the screen, he's a guy called Mohammed Hijab. And the next day, the day after they'd been in Golders Green filming this thing, there was a pro-Israel demonstration at the Israeli embassy in London, and he turned up to the counter-protest against it. And I'm going to try and play you now a short video of part of his speech at that counter-protest.
We are here, standing in the streets of London, in the heart of London, to proclaim with all vehemency and all vigor that we will never, ever leave the side of the Palestinians. Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! And the difference between us and them is this. The difference between us and them is that for them, they think life begins. For us, we believe that death begins. We believe that life begins at death. We don't care about death. We love death. And if you think that our people in Palestine or across the Arab and Muslim world will let go of the struggle and our sacred places like Al-Aqsa, you are grossly mistaken.
Okay, so I want to show that because the language is incredibly fiery, incredibly inflammatory, but it's the kind of language we've seen from jihadist groups a lot over the years. We don't care about death, we love death, all the rest of it. And that, in a way, is a continuation of something we've seen, like I say, from Hamas and from other jihadist groups for a long time. But what is new here is that this guy does not run an organization. Right? He's not a leader of one of the kind of well-known Islamist organizations like Al-Muhajirin or Hizb ut-Tahrir or the other formal structures that we're used to dealing with. He's an influencer on YouTube. He makes videos on YouTube and he gets loads of people to watch them. And the other two people who did that stunt with the van in Golders Green with him, again, that's what they are. They're YouTubers. And this is where the kind of the narrative drive is coming from. This is where the political energy is coming from now. It's very much online, and it's from it's not from formalized organizations. Same with the car convoys. The car convoys were not organized by formal organizations in different communities or different political bodies in the way that perhaps they might have been a decade ago. It was just informal networks in different towns and cities. And this is it's a reflection of kind of, I suppose, a network world and a social media world. This is how politics is organized now. And this brings me on to really the last thing that I want to talk about, which is the role of influencers in general, right? And I'm moving away from anti-Semitism now. I'm talking more broadly about the atmosphere in which the public debate, and especially for younger people, the kind of common sense notions of what Israel-Palestine is all about gets framed and who it is that frames it and how it gets set. And one thing that was really different in this conflict compared to other ones was celebrity influencers. Here you've got Bella Hadid, who's a model, Mark Ruffalo, who's an actor, both of whom posted content online, really quite extreme content online about Israel. They got a huge amount of engagement and a huge amount of attention, and really drove the what we were seeing, certainly amongst young people, and certainly on social media amongst young people. You know, that Israel's committing a genocide, that it's it's comparable to apartheid or Nazi Germany. I think there were various conspiracy theories that Bella Hadid posted as well. And this, in terms of where does all this come from, and why is it people get so fired up about Israel, Palestine, and what is it that frames what people just assume to be the case, and how they understand the conflict, and how they understand it to not even be a conflict, but to be a case of colonialism and so on. The role of social media, the role of influencers is massive. And in the UK, we saw it from a lot of footballers, right? These are, some of the most famous footballers in the country, from Leicester City after they just won the FA Cup, from Man United, from Arsenal, posting stuff on social media. Now, footballers a few years ago would never get involved in politics, and something that is very new over the last couple of years is footballers getting involved in politics, especially with combating racism, but also Marcus Rashford with his campaign about child poverty. And this has been welcomed and has been celebrated, and these very powerful, influential voices. And this is one aspect of it, is that during the conflict, we saw a lot of players, well, certainly these players and others, taking up the Palestinian cause as the thing they were going to post online about. And again, this is the broader framing. This is the broader kind of shaping of the atmosphere in which everything else takes place. And I talk about the impact on young people in schools of this framing. And we saw this kind of impact on campus as well. And this is what I'm going to finish with, is the anti-Semitic incident figures on university campuses that we recorded at CST, not just in the month of May, but for the last 3 academic years. And as you can see, the last academic year, 2020 to 21, was a record number of anti-Semitic incidents affecting Jewish students, Jewish academics, Jewish student bodies, mostly either on campus or online or offline, but in their capacity as students. And this is where the kind of all the things I'm talking about, really, the social media narratives and discourse, the role of influencers, all the stuff going on demonstrations, all the political process, who does it land on? Where does it really land? And I think that one of the things that was really new this time is the extent to which it landed on young people, on secondary school age and student age, university age, young Jewish people. And I think when we look at the challenges that came out of this conflict, I think one of the main challenges really is how we address that, how we address the impact on young people, not just of the anti-Semitism, but of the broader narratives that are not necessarily anti-Semitic in themselves, but kind of set the terms and create the environment in which the anti-Semitism then happens. I'm going to finish speaking at that point. I'm very happy to take questions. I can see there's a few comments in the chat. Chloe, do you want me to just go through the questions in the chat? Is that the easiest way to do it? So one question about why mainstream media cover a very minor conflict, much more than they cover other conflicts. I mean, this is a question that's been around for a very long time, and I think there are a lot of different answers to this. Some of them are quite prosaic. It's a much easier conflict to cover, especially if you're from European media. It's very close by, but it's a relatively safe conflict to cover. It's a conflict you can get to, whereas you can't, to cover the what's happening to the Uyghurs in China. It's much harder to get there, to be allowed in and be allowed to cover it. But I think also, I think what happens in Israel and in Palestine gets covered more because audiences can relate to it more, simply because it's happening in the land that is so foundational to Western civilization. You know, when you have a story about something happening in Jerusalem, everyone's heard of Jerusalem. Jerusalem matters to billions of people in a way that other places in other parts of the world don't necessarily. And you can also extend that, I think, to argue that in the Western psyche, you know, Jews matter, Jews play a role, even subconsciously in a way that other people don't. Is from the river to the sea a secular slogan? Look, I take your point. From the river to the sea is definitely, it's not necessarily just a secular slogan. It's definitely a slogan used by Hamas and by Hamas supporters and so on. But what it chimes in with is sort of anti-Zionism, certainly in Britain, up until the mid-1990s, was very much shaped by the idea of campaigning for a secular democratic state in place of Israel. And that was very much an idea that came from Arab nationalism, from the PLO, from Fatah, and was taken up by groups on the far left of British politics. Now, what we see and what was on that placard is the idea of the secular democratic state, the single state, combined with the slogan from the river to the sea. And of course, that slogan can, from the river to the sea, it can be whatever you want it to be, because it doesn't give an answer as to what replaces what is currently in that territory. Right? So you get this merging, this mixing of ideologies. Eva Simmons, you have your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
No good. Okay. I would say, Dave, sorry, this is Paul. I'm with Eva. So I
hello.
just wanted to make just one comment, one question. We're sort of members of the Labour Party, and that leads to all sorts of issues. And
we are members of
the Labour Party. And of course, we're noticing a lot of activity, especially amongst young Labour, about the issue of Palestine. A lot of motions going around the country through Momentum and others. That's one thing I'm noticing. But I'm just wondering, also, if you're noticing the same incidents that you're seeing here in Western Europe and also in the USA, because clearly there's been pressure on students in those countries too, and on secondary school students, and in the colleges and campuses. Just wondering if you're coordinating with other groups like yours who are seeing the same amounts of issues around anti-Semitism and the Gaza issue. Sure.
So in terms of the Labour Party, the situation in the Labour Party is better than it was a few years ago. Definitely, and we see fewer anti-Semitic incidents coming into us. But I think you're right that in the grassroots and certainly in the younger echelons of the party, that's where you see a lot of this stuff happening. And I think probably at that level, there are more problematic views more widely held than we see in the kind of parliamentary party or in the leadership and so on. I think what's going on, you know, in the bit of the iceberg beneath the surface in the Labour Party is still probably, there's problems there. In terms of what we see in other countries, look, we did see similar trends in other countries. I don't have data to hand, and I'm always a bit wary about relying just on the more high profile incidents that we see across different countries. But generally speaking, when we get these kind of surges in anti-Semitism in reaction to what's happening in Israel, we see it in lots of countries. And certainly in the US during the conflict, there were a worrying number of incidents that involved a worrying degree of violence, certainly a higher level of violence in some of the incidents in America than we'd seen in this country. And I also think, you know, a lot of what we see playing out on British campuses plays out on a lot of American campuses. And you can even make an argument that campuses, that there are, in a way, bigger problems on some American campuses than there are here. It's very hard to make that judgment from a distance, but certainly it looks like a lot of the politics is the same, but perhaps the broader political environment in the US is a bit more fractious than it is here. I can't remember who put up their hand first. It might have been Daniel. I could be wrong, but Daniel, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I just wanted to push you on this from the river to the sea thing, if that's okay. Because the beauty of the slogan, and beauty here is in heavy inverted commas, of course, is that it can mean anything. A lot of people don't know what it means literally. It is a very ambiguous slogan. But it seems to me that the context is, I mean, Arab nationalism is very much kind of on the wane. Even Palestinian nationalism is on the wane. And what has come to the fore is Islamism. And so the beauty of it from that perspective is that it's a kind of Islamist slogan. So it's not even for a Palestinian state. I think that the poster you showed is unusual because it was explicitly calling for a Palestinian state, whereas it's completely compatible with the call for a caliphate, completely compatible with an Islamist worldview, without saying that explicitly, which seems to me is deeply problematic.
Yeah, no, look, I'd agree with that. That's the beauty of the slogan. And it's also, I mean, people who use the slogan claim it's completely compatible with the two-state solution as well, because all they're saying is Palestinians aren't free, which I would dispute, because if they wanted the slogan to say Palestinians instead of Palestine, it would still scam. But yeah, it's one of the, the best political slogans are the ones that can mean different things to different people, but everyone can join in with it. And I think what it reflects is, you're right. Where is Arab nationalism today, right? And and to the extent that Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist, but even by the end of his rule, he was using religious language as for his kind of claims to legitimacy and so on. So you do get this kind of mixing and merging, but that in itself, I think, is interesting. A decade ago, you had people on anti-Israel demonstrations in London chanting Khyber, Khyber, Ya Yahud. They would never have been wearing Saddam Hussein t-shirts, right? So I think that mixing, that blurring, that kind of cherry picking of different images and icons and language into this kind of cocktail of anti-Israelism is itself an interesting thing and a new development. And yes, absolutely, the Islamist side of it is very important. Esther, do you want to ask your question?
Director of the Wolf Institute. And I have a comment. Thank you first, Dave, very much for your very clear and convincing presentation on these new trends. And I have a comment and a question, really. The comment is that I think we can see the clear benefit of campaigns to fight anti-Semitism in the left in Germany, where between, let's say, 2005 and now, there has been a complete shift in the way that the left aligns with Israel. So before, in the 90s, the left would be typically very pro-Palestinian, very much like this country, like Labour is in this country. And I think there were quite substantial campaigns from within left-wing organizations that actually sort of pushed for an alignment with Israel and to support Israel. And that is now pretty much the sort of the common trope within the left, that the left supports Israel because of Germany's past, whereas the right is on the Palestinian side, which is a very, very interesting dichotomy, in the British context. But my question is, many of the Muslim charities that we work with are very, very eager to combat anti-Semitism in Muslim communities. And what we've heard from various people is that they would like to see data which really clearly shows that Muslim communities have greater anti-Semitic tendencies, because they believe that having such data would convince community leaders to spring into action and to combat anti-Semitism in Muslim communities. Is such data available? Do you have a good study that shows that there is a greater anti-Semitic tendency in Muslim British communities as opposed to the left? Or
so we do, and I'm looking at Daniel Stetsky, who's on the call here, because a few years ago, his organisation, the Institute of Jewish Policy Research, and my own CST, did a joint project with, I think at the time it was the biggest opinion poll ever done in this country of attitudes towards Jews and attitudes towards Israel. And one of the things we did was to drill down into levels of anti-Semitism amongst different religious communities, not just amongst Muslims, but different Christian communities as well. And what that opinion poll showed, it's on the CST website, it's on the JPR website. What it showed is that levels of anti-Semitism amongst British Muslims are higher than in the population as a whole, significantly higher. In fact, the presence of anti-Semitism amongst British Muslims was largely comparable to the presence of anti-Semitism amongst people who describe themselves politically as being very right-wing, so which was the most extreme end of the right-wing political spectrum that we polled for. But it also showed most Muslims did not hold anti-Semitic views. So it was a minority of British Muslims who were anti-Semitic, but a larger minority than in the population as a whole. Daniel, you can correct me if I've misremembered, but I think that's what it showed. Now, that's not the only poll that's done it. The ADL Global 100 poll in 2015, I believe, asked similar questions and came up with similar answers. There have been other polls in other countries. Gunter Jikele, I think, has done some really good work putting this research work together, looking at polling in different countries. But yes, the data is there. It is a very, very sensitive issue, obviously, to raise. That doesn't mean it can't be raised. If it's there, it has to be discussed. But some people do not even want to look at the polling. Never mind hear anything anecdotal. So it is an issue. But yeah, the data's there. David Massas, you've had your hand up.
Try to unmute myself there. I think I've done that. First of all, I'm from Canada, and statistically, the data we've seen in Canada parallel what we've seen in what you've told us about in the UK. There's record numbers and a particular spike at the time of the Hamas assault on Israel. The League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith produces statistics, and that's what the statistics show. I did have a question. You referred to the challenges that this situation creates, and you mentioned there's some prosecutions in the offing, and you mentioned Holocaust education. And do you have any suggestions about, other than what's already in place, about what can be done to respond to these challenges?
I think it needs a range of different responses, because it's always easier to describe the problem than it is to come up with the ways to deal with the problem. Well, prosecutions are really important. People should be arrested and prosecuted and convicted for hate crimes, not just because on those individual cases you want people to face justice, but to deter others, to boost the confidence of the Jewish community. But that will only tackle a certain part of the problem. We can look to education, is very important, but it has to be the right kind of education. So Holocaust education is on the national curriculum in this country, and it's the only subject in history that is mandated to be taught. But there's a difference between teaching people about the Holocaust and teaching people about anti-Semitism. It doesn't necessarily teach you about other types of anti-Semitism, about the type of anti-Semitism British Jews face today. And there is a broader need for awareness of, just more broad awareness and education about Jews and about Jewishness, because most people in Britain don't know any Jewish people, or don't know Jewish people very well. So before we even get to talking about anti-Semitism, there's a job to do to make people more aware of the Jewish community in a more positive way. Then there's the whole issue of how you deal with the way that social media fuels and shapes so much of the both online but also offline hate. Now, there is going to be regulation of the internet and of social media platforms coming into law in this country, hopefully by the end of this year. that may help to tackle some of the problems. But I think it would be foolish to hope that we can rely on legislation and prosecution and regulation to really deal with what ultimately is a narrative problem. And what are the narratives that create the atmosphere in which Jewish school kids suddenly find all their friends won't talk to them because they don't have Free Palestine on their Instagram bio? You know, that is a much bigger challenge, and that is about what is the way that people are interpreting and understanding these issues, not just the issue of Israel and Palestine, but the issues of Jews, of anti-Semitism. There is the fact that conspiracy theories are more popular amongst young people in this country than amongst old people. And where conspiracy theories are more popular, anti-Semitism will also be more popular. So you've got the whole supercharging of conspiracy theories during the pandemic and the impact that that's had. And the other thing that happened, the other thing that I should have mentioned in my presentation, that is the broader context for all of this, is that May last year is when the first sort of the first tranche of lockdown restrictions got lifted last year. And the restrictions on movement and behaviour were just eased a bit in May. And I think a lot of the anti-Semitism, a lot of the size of the demonstrations, the anger of the demonstrations was about people letting off steam. And there are lots of different contexts in British life last summer, last year, where we saw these absolute explosions of energy, positive and negative, in public, that were clearly about the release from the pandemic. And I think that actually influenced the size of the peak of the anti-Semitism as well. So there's all sorts of stuff that go into this. There will never be one simple answer to how to deal with this problem, partly because the problem manifests in so many different ways. Charles, you've had your hand up.
Dave, thanks for the presentation and all of the great work that you and your colleagues are doing. A quick point, I think the ADL survey, they have very good information on different demographic groups in society and their levels of anti-Semitism. And it's being continuously updated, and we use some of their data to do the study that showed the correlation between what we called Israel bashing and classical forms of anti-Semitism. And in 10 European countries, Muslim communities had a significantly higher level of anti-Semitism compared to the general population in 2006. And I suspect it's similar today. I know it's similar today. But what was interesting, we got our article published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and it was a real struggle to get this sort of scientific, very high-level data accepted into the article. It took a lot, and eventually they did include it. And I think, 15 years later, these issues are being, I think, discussed more openly and more accurately. So there's been some progress on that, and it's important to present the data to communities and to policymakers. And
it's 13 now.
It is an issue for many reasons. My quick question, and this is just sort of an informal observation. During the protest in May, I enjoy going to protests. So I went to a few in London and in Oxford, and I was struck by what appeared to be kind of what I would consider to be Islamists who were there, kind of radical Muslims. And there were a lot of there was a Turkish presence, I found. So I don't know, did you also see that in your assessment?
Not in a big way. That might have been a local thing. To the extent that we get political extremism in the Turkish community in this country, it tends to be more kind of Marxist than Islamist. So I don't know exactly who it was you saw, but it may well be from that angle. But that's, that's something we very much saw in these demonstrations. For all that we can talk about anti-Semitism from Muslim communities and Islamism and so on, a large part of the demonstrations and the protests and the stuff on social media was coming from the left. And this is partly a legacy of everything that was stirred up in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn everything over anti-Semitism. The way that Corbyn's time ended has left a huge amount of resentment and bitterness in parts of the far left, who basically blame the Jewish community for his downfall. But also amongst the younger generation, we saw Free Palestine just become the next kind of online social movement trends that followed, Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion and Me Too and all these sort of big campaigns that washed through kind of youth social media, and Free Palestine was the next one. And that's why we saw a lot of what we did in schools and universities. And of course, the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that we had to deal with under Jeremy Corbyn mostly did not involve Muslim Party members. It was your kind of old, white, British, far left, kind of Trotskyist type people. We can sometimes overplay, I think, the role of Muslim anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism from within Muslim communities in the broader picture. It comes in at times like this, where we have the conflict in Israel and Gaza. And then at other times, there'll be other triggers and other drivers, and it comes from elsewhere. Like I say, last year was the 5th year of 5 out of the last 6 years that we've seen record anti-Semitic incident totals. And one of the things in the CST and JPR report, one of the conclusions is that the Muslim community and the number of people who, according to that poll in the Muslim community, held anti-Semitic views are just not numerous enough to really shape anti-Semitism across British society as a whole. And that to the extent that anti-Semitic attitudes exist across British society, they really are across the whole piece, across the whole of society. And it's a much broader kind of issue. And then you'll get different segments kind of becoming more prominent at different times, depending on just what's going on at that time. There are a couple of questions. There's a couple of questions written in the Q&A, which are kind of similar, so I'll put them together. It's kind of about Israeli or Jewish groups being part of the kind of anti-Israel milieu, I suppose. And that is very much part of the problem. And that is where I suppose the challenge of distinguishing between what you might consider or call legitimate political activism and positions and so on, differentiating between that and, anti-Semitism or anti-Israel hatred becomes even harder, I think, is where you're dealing with that. And it is something it's something that's always been there, I think, since the days of Matt's pen in the 1960s. But it's definitely something that is a prominent feature in how Jewish communities deal with these issues now, is that the presence and the visibility and the organisation of sort of contrary voices from within the Jewish community or from within Israel is a very, very significant part of the landscape. Ava, your hand is up, but I don't know if it's the same hand from before or a new hand.
No, the other one was my partner, Paul, and this is me.
Okay.
And what I wanted to say is that you touched on Black Lives Matter and so forth. It seems to me that some of the anti-Semitism, and I don't want to be too generalizing here, but it comes from a corner of anti-racism. And what concerns me is how you persuade or convince people that anti-Semitism is also a form of racism, and that when you're combating racism, you ought, but may not be, also combating anti-Semitism. And I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
I mean, this is very much a message that we try to drive forward, is exactly that, is that when you're doing your anti-racist campaigns, you have to include anti-Semitism in that. And it tends to be the less politicized an organization or a person is, the more open they are to that idea because it just sounds like common sense. So when we talk to people in the sporting world who have got anti-racist campaigns in football or cricket or whatever, to them that's just obvious. It's just common sense, even if they haven't thought of it before. But where you get into more politicized arenas, the problem we have is, and it's an unintended consequence, I think. Black Lives Matter taught a generation of activists, a generation of progressive people, that not only is racism about colour, but that all oppression is about racism and is about colour. And therefore, when you look at a situation that involves oppression of one population by another, which is how they perceive Israel and Palestine, therefore it must be a manifestation of racism, and it must be a manifestation of the same racism we're seeing in our own countries. And that is the framing that Black Lives Matter teaches people to use when interpreting any conflict situation, basically. And that is, I think, that has made it harder, I think, to deal with the anti-Semitism that emanates from this world, from this anti-Israel world, is because that framing really shuts the door to an understanding of what is actually going on. I think have we reached the end? Chloe, shall I hand back?
Yeah, I think we've reached the end of our time together. So again, please join me in welcoming Dave to speak with us today. Such a fascinating talk, and I'm sure we all learned so much. So thank you. You can see in the chat that our next upcoming seminar will take place in 2 weeks. It will be on Monday, March 7th, and it will be with Harass, who is the managing director of ISGAP, and he will be speaking on pathways to Islamist radicalization and the triple threat. And so please, until then, thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you, Dave, for a great talk.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.